Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel gelişmelere, meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta Çin'den kıymetli bir konuğumuz var. American University, Washington DC Uluslararası İlişkiler Bölümü öğretim üyesi, aynı zamanda üniversitenin Asya Çalışmaları Merkezi'nin başkanı. AK Parti Genel Başkanlığı tarafından İstanbul'da düzenlenen 21. yüzyılda siyaset ve yeni açılımlar forumu için kendisi İstanbul'da. Gelmişken stüdyomuza davet ettik ve biraz Çin'i konuşacağız. ABD-Çin ilişkilerini konuşacağız. Çin'in geleceğini konuşacağız kendisiyle. Profesör Quansheng Zhao bizlerle. Welcome, Professor. Thank you very much for coming here and welcome to Istanbul.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's our pleasure. Professor, of course, we will talk about China today a lot, but I want to start from domestic Chinese politics first. Chinese leader Xi Jinping further consolidated power at the Communist Party Congress recently. What was the significance of this? What does stronger Xi mean for China and for the world? Shall we expect from Beijing a more aggressive posture at home and abroad from now on?
I think this is the very significant party congress called the 20th Party Congress. Particularly if you look at the history, 1921, the party was established, and last year just celebrated 100-year anniversary, and this is 101, 2022. So the party, Xi Jinping consolidated his leadership. There are, like you said, two meanings. Domestically, that means the party could concentrate all its own ideas, powers, to continue the economic reform and openness started by Deng Xiaoping, and fulfill what the Chinese called the China dream, rejuvenation of the national pride. I guess that's the ultimate goal for the Chinese Communist Party. Externally, I would not use the word aggressive, but rather I would use assertive. We all understand China suffered before 1949 and what they called 100-year humiliation, starting from the Opium War of 1839. British started the Opium War, and there are a number of unequal treaties, including the colonial status of Hong Kong and the colonial status of Japan, I mean, Taiwan to Japan. So this 100-year really gave a very deep hurt of Chinese mentality. And now China finally stand up and would like to stick this more assertive foreign policy. I guess that's the whole world can face. And actually, if we look at the past three stages after 1949, the first stage called the era of Mao, yes. The second era of Deng, and now we see the era of Xi. So Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping, and each would have their own priority. And under Mao, what I called is a revolution. And under Deng, what I called is modernization. Under Xi, what I would call rejuvenation. So those are three different, there are three also terms. That's called 站起来, 富起来, 强起来, by Chinese characters.
I see.
Mao 站起来 means stand up for independence. And Deng Xiaoping would be 富起来, getting rich, modernization. And Xi Jinping would be 强起来, would be getting strong. So now it's the third stage, getting strong. So I would say this is a continuation ever since 1949. this is the process.
I see. Okay, Professor, there are a lot of topics, also foreign policy issues, relations with the U.S. That I want to ask you. But at this point, I would like to ask you about one of the most important, of course, topics for the whole world is U.S.-China competition. Relations are worsening, as you know. It's often called a new kind of Cold War. What is really going on between U.S. and China? Because you're a Chinese academic who lives in the United States for a very long time, so you have both perspectives. Are we really headed to a new Cold War? What do you see from Chinese point of view and also from U.S. point of view? What is really driving this tension? And is there a way to prevent this Cold War, so-called Cold War?
Indeed, as you mentioned, I came to the United States 4 decades ago, more than 4 decades ago, and spending my most of academic life in the United States. I do look at this long process we see from the U.S. foreign policy perspective, from engagement to, well, similar to containment, but they are not using that term.
Yeah.
But we do see a confrontational status, whether you call it Cold War or you call it confrontation. I think that would be a relatively long process, yet with some new meanings. Because if we look at the U.S. foreign policy after World War II, we see one of the major strategic priorities is to keep its own leadership in global settings and all to keep its own hegemony. So hegemonic position is a key priority for the United States. Of course, they would not want to use hegemony, but they use leadership, global leadership in all dimensions: political, economic, military, technology, and culture, and every front. And in that sense, they try to identify the next challengers. Who will be the one that challenging that leadership position? Started with the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and then moved to Japan. I'm also studying Japan for the past decades. Japan challenging the United States, Washington policy known as Japan bashing. During the 1980s and 1990s, we see a lot of trade frictions, economic wars between the United States and Japan. And then when Japan declined in a relative sense, back to the late 1990s, all the way to this century, we see China rising. And then China was identified as top challenger. And now we can see, even from the most recent US military strategic report, and made very clear, China is the #1 challenger to the United States.
Security threat, they call it.
Security threat, security threat. They also emphasize 2 parts if you read the report. That is capacity and intention. Not every power had that capacity, and not every power had that intention. And from that report, you can see saying China is virtually the only power today globally had that kind of capacity, all-round capacity. That is economic, military, culture, and also political system. And according to that report, China also had that intention. That's one reason for Washington today to identify China as the next challenger. Of course, Beijing would not agree with that argument.
Professor, at this point, I also want to ask you, because there are also a lot of countries in the region, in the Middle East, in our region, contemplate whether China can replace the US as the region's security provider, main security provider. How willing do you think, you said capacity and intention, so how willing do you think, or China has the capacity and intention really to play that role in the Gulf or in the Arab region, in the Middle East in general? Or let me put it this way, does China have the superpower mentality?
Well, I would say, yes, China gradually would have that capacity, but I would say that U.S.-China relations would be in a situation not one replace the other one. Actually, I call that as a two-pillar leadership structure. There would be two parallel leaders, not one placing another, but rather complementary to each other. I don't think China would like to replace the United States, but rather would like to catch up, just like China catch up Japan eventually. So I would think if we look at the contemporary world, there will be a phenomena, what I call is 4 non-stops. That is, China's growth will not stop. U.S. viewing China as top threat or challenger will not stop. And U.S. utilizing the Taiwan issue as a Taiwan card will not stop.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you also that.
And finally, both countries continue to grow and continue to maintain is in a relative sense, solid position in world politics would not stop. That's why I call that 4 non-stop. Talking about Middle East, compared to other powers, such as old powers like Great Britain, Germany, France, and United States, China relatively is a newcomer in terms of post-World War II era. Of course, China has a long tradition of a connection with the Middle East via Silk Road, but that's a history.
So there is Belt and Road.
That's Belt and Road. But I would say that China has immense interest in Middle East and will continue growing its influence. But at the same time, just like in global setting, I don't think China would intend to replace the United States. Whether China has the intention, I think so. I think China has a great interest in all round, but in this particular sense, is not necessarily military, but rather economic and trade, because we all understand China is one of the biggest importer of energy, oil, gas, and others. And the Middle East is a huge natural resources. At the same time, China also had the capacity for, you just mentioned, One Belt and One Road project. And China has a close ties now, not only with the Middle East. If you look at Africa, China has a long tradition with Africa. So I think all this process will continue. But rather, instead of a military strategic issue, it's more on economic and trade front, such as infrastructure, such as energy, and other cooperations.
So this tension between US and China will continue maybe forever then. We will see that escalation, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it will continue. But do you think, what are the main major problematic areas that might really give trouble? For example, Taiwan is an important issue, I believe, and also now close relationship with Russia also, and also technology as well. This, speaking of Taiwan issue, Professor, do you think China might invade Taiwan in that scenario because things might get worse? What do you think? What's your expectation?
First of all, I wouldn't say U.S.-China confrontation would forever. They're always up and down.
Yes, sure.
You know, we do see potential for future cooperation as well. But for Taiwan issue, yes, there's definitely a, you know, the economist described Taiwan Strait as one of the most dangerous place in the world. I would say that the Taiwan issue, even from Washington perspective, is called One China policy. Is recognizing there has been a one China, but divided between mainland China and Taiwan across Taiwan Strait because of the not Cold War, because of the Civil War, 1946 to 1949. With that particular separation, and now it's more than 70 years, you know, ever since 1949 of the Cold War. I don't think China would be very much in the hurry, so-called this year or next year, but China would be very alert by two things. One, Taiwan independence. If there are so-called the Green Party, the Democratic called the DPP, Progressive Party, if continue move toward independence, that means permanent separation across Taiwan Strait. China would not allow that happen. Second, if the U.S. military intervention, for example, the U.S. send military troops and the ships to Taiwan, that means foreign powers intervention. With those two scenarios, among others, the conflict will escalate.
How likely do you think these scenarios are?
I think it really depends on, you know, look at Russian-Ukraine war. You don't really know if there is a one side, you know, moving up. So indeed, there is a tension. There is a potential for danger. So it's really depends on wisdom of leaders across Taiwan Strait, and also wisdom of a global community to keep the situation under control. So that's a very key issue. Of course, China eventually would like to have unification with Taiwan. But at the same time, China can wait as long as there is no challenge for China's sovereignty as a unified country.
Professor, we have a very limited time left. So my last question will be, because there's a continuous debate and mixed expectations on whether Chinese economy will overtake the US. Since you're an economy channel, I would like to ask you this as a final question. Chinese economy will overtake the US or not, sooner or later? What's your estimation? And if this happens, what will be the implications? And also, what are the obstacles and challenges for China to grow further, do you think, domestic and international? For example, zero COVID policy is, I think, not helping the country much. What do you think about Chinese economy overtaking the US in recent future?
I would say for the first 3 decades, ever since 1978, Deng Xiaoping launched open reform policy, China's economic growth average more than 10%. But most recent few years, particularly during the pandemics, declined, and this year only like 3 or 4%, very low. So we do see a potential for low growth. In that case, many economists revised that prediction that would take more years for China to catch up with the United States. More importantly, technology. China has also has a gap with the United States, particularly in the semiconductor industry, among others. So I would say, again, back to my old theme, China and the United States would remain as a two pillar in global setting. in all round, military, economic, political. But United States still keeping a leading position, at least for now.
Professor, thank you very much. Since you're in Istanbul, and I think it's your first time in Istanbul, I would like to hear your thoughts about Turkey, if you like, your final words about Turkey in general, Turkish foreign policy in the region. We have also good relations with China. Would you like to say anything about Turkey?
Of course, yeah. This is really delightful for me to be first time in Istanbul, although I was in Ankara before. But I really enjoyed. I know Turkey and China are two old civilizations, and they have a connection back to Han Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, very, very early time. So I think it's really a good time for the two old civilizations to renew their friendship. Actually, they already started the effort and continue to learn each other. My understanding is even during Chinese Revolution, back to the late Qing Dynasty, many revolutionaries started to look at Turkey, like the Young Turkish Revolution. They learned from Turkey as well. I guess this is a mutual learning process. For myself, it's also my own learning experience. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor. Lovely to have you on my show. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Çinli akademisyen, American University, Washington DC'den Uluslararası İlişkiler Bölümü öğretim üyesi, aynı zamanda da üniversitenin Asya Çalışmaları Merkezi Direktörü Quansheng Zhao'yu ağırladık. Çin'i konuştuk, Çin-ABD ilişkilerini, Çin'in gelecekteki ekonomisini, siyasetini, pek çok başlığı konuşmaya çalıştık. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.